Good morning, everyone. I call to order the June meeting of the Audit and Compliance Committee. I want to welcome you all. It's a very nice day outside. Does the chair have discretion to move the meeting outside? Would anyone entertain that motion? But anyway, before we begin, I'd like to welcome our student representatives. First, we have Sia Buttar from the Twin Cities campus. Welcome. And we have Riley Tuft from the Duluth campus. Welcome. Thank you both for being with us here this morning, and we look forward to your contributions to our agenda. And with that, let's turn to set agenda. Today's agenda is very internal audit focused, which is good. We have two important items. And the first item will be the internal audit update. And with that, I will turn it over to Chief Auditor Galsworth. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, members of the committee. So this first item on the agenda is our standard update that we provide to you all 3 times a year. So I would draw your attention to begin with on page 6 of your docket materials. We have our follow-up results. A couple of things to highlight here. Implementation rate this period was 29% on our outstanding essential items. This is again below our expected rate of 40%. It's also slightly lower than it was last period of 32%. That being said, I think it's important to highlight that half of the outstanding essential recommendations are with one audit. That's the School of Dentistry, where they continue to make good progress. They're trying to work to get through the many issues that were identified in that report, but they've had some staffing issues related, especially in the administration areas, and their remediation efforts have been complicated by having to remediate across multiple systems in some cases. So the Provost Office continues to oversee and make sure that progress is being made there, and OIT continues to provide support in the IT issues. So I'm not overly concerned about these results, given the fact that it is really related to one particular audit, but we can talk about that more at the end of my remarks if you have questions. The number of items that are past due this period is 41%. That's similar to last periods where we had 42%. This is past due based upon what the management action plan stated in the audit report for when they believed the essential items would be remediated. On page 7 of your document materials, we have the items that are 2 years past due. When we cross that threshold, we provide a little bit more information on why those items are outstanding and what they pertain to. I will say that one of these items, the item related to psychiatry, some additional info was provided to us after we submitted the docket materials. And so we now believe that that has been remediated, and that'll be reflected in the October report. A new schedule I'm providing this period is on page 9 of your materials. What I'm trying to show with this chart, or what we're trying to show with this chart, is the increase in the number of timeline, or the expanded timeline for the remediation on some of our essential items. If you look at the reports that were issued in FY18, all of those were completed within 2-year periods. 20 of those took over 1 year. It's important to note whenever we're talking about essential items that not all essential items are created equal. Sometimes it can be done literally within a week in order to remediate something that's important. Sometimes it really can take a year, and that could be planned by management when they respond to our issues in our report. However, I think this chart does demonstrate that since FY18, we have had an increase in the number of issues that have really gone beyond the 2-year mark. And I think that ties pretty closely to the start of the pandemic, staffing constraints associated with that during the pandemic and post. And I think it also is likely due to just some of the complexity of the issues that we're identifying. But I thought this just kind of helped to visualize what we've been seeing happening. All right, so for other work that we completed, we had 6 audits that had all of their outstanding items fully remediated. So we always want to call that out. That's always good work. On page 10, we have our collaborative assessment update. This is related to the Identity and Access Management Collaborative Assessment that we completed 2 years ago. As we've spoken to the committee about before, we did not issue this as a standard report, and we're not doing follow-up on it in a standard way, in part because of the complexity associated with some of these issues, the number of units involved, And frankly, we knew that it was going to be a multi-year effort in order to address these items. This period's update has some additional information on changes in timelines, some info related to an update that they're working on a new identity system that needs to be implemented as kind of a foundational work to address some of these other issues. As a reminder to the committee, we do intend to go back and do audit work to confirm the remediation of these items once we're at a point where there's enough completed that we can kind of go back and do that. On page 30 of your docket materials, we have our other we have a summary of our audit activity. So this period we completed 6 audits and 1 SNAP review related to foreign wire payments. All but one of these reports we rated at our highest rating of good. The one audit report we had that was in the needs improvement category was UMD Health Services. I think it's important to note that UMD Health Services has been doing some really important work in really difficult situations with the pandemic over the last couple of years. And I really do believe that they're trying to do the right thing and meet policy and regulatory requirements. However, they're just in a very highly regulated space in healthcare, and we found a number of issues related to information technology and compliance. So we rated that one as a needs improvement. 2 other audits I want to highlight is the RIO and hiring pause with exception is one of the 2. We found that effort was ultimately successful in reducing the headcount of 984 people as of fall 2021. And that being said, though, we did find that there were some procedural issues, documentation issues, and some monitoring oversight recommendations that we provided for future programs. The other one I would like to highlight is the COVID-19 research pre-award process, primarily because there were no issues identified in this report, which I think is remarkable given the amount of pressure that researchers were under and frankly the university and the larger world was under at the beginning of the pandemic to really try to understand what we were dealing with. In our review, we found that all procedures were followed appropriately, which I think is really commendable. The other audits that we completed were on housing and residential life here in the Twin Cities, family medicine and community health, and then the School of Public Health dean transition. One final item I would want to highlight on our audit activity report is we conducted a system-wide testing of students' self-reported COVID-19 vaccine status. And in that testing, we found that 100% of the students who stated that they were vaccinated were indeed vaccinated if they enrolled in the FY22, if they enrolled in the spring semester. Again, I think these are very, very good results. Frankly, maybe better than what some people may have expected, but we were ultimately able to confirm that. And that sample was across all the campuses. We looked at 100 here at the Twin Cities and Rochester, 50 up at Duluth, and then 50 at the Morris and Crookston campuses. So with that, I will pause for any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Chief Auditor Galswick. I will turn to the committee for discussion, question, or comments. Regent Mayer.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. Thank you for the report. And when I review these presentations, I look at all the documents quickly. Then I go back and look again. And when I looked at this initially, my first run through, I saw a lot of red and got concerned. Then I saw quite a bit of yellow, still concerned. And so I just wanted to state that we have expectations to not have the red or the yellow, but I appreciate how you gave us the explanation on some of the timelines and issues there. But I think it's important that the community knows that we pay attention to this, and this is really important for the university. And so I just wanted to emphasize that. And then thank you for the way you manage it and move things forward.
Thank you, Regent Davenport, and thank you for not taking an affront to me calling you Regent Mayer. Was that just a comment?
Yeah,
okay, well, it's a bit of a compliment, right? Regent Swiggum.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Quinn, you and I had a chance to correspond a little bit in email regarding the audit of the freeze, pause, without exception. I think it was changed to at one time or another. It kind of evolved there as we looked at it. I just want to, on the record, be able to say, use a number without, changing the number or making the number sound better than it is. 984 is the number I can publicly attribute to the salary or the hiring freeze, pause, without exception, and be fair and honest with everybody in the public.
Yep. Chair Kenyanya, Regent Sviggum, yes, as of fall of 2021. Now, that being said, obviously, some of those positions are being rehired and,
I understand, yeah.
But as of fall of 2021, that is accurate.
Okay, which was a direct consequence of the hiring freeze.
I would say that it definitely was a major contributing force. It's hard to say exactly, would somebody have left without the Rio? Who knows? Maybe they would have. Similarly, maybe a unit would have chosen not to rehire anyway that particular position. But I think it is highly probable that those two are correlated.
Okay, I just want to be fair.
Yep. That's.
Any other questions on this agenda item? Briefly, Chief Auditor Galswick, on the SNAP reviews, how do those come to be? Are those requested by the administration, or it's my understanding that they're maybe not part of the plan, but you quickly go in and look at something? Can you talk to those?
Sure, Chair Kenyanya, members of the committee. So the SNAP reviews are something that we started, let's say 2 or 3 years ago, maybe it's longer than that, where what we do is if we see a consistent issue in number of audits, we might say, maybe we should just target this particular area and see, do we have a larger trend here that we want to provide to the process owners? That's one of the ways we may identify as an area for SNAP review. Another potential is just it's an area of interest or concern, but we don't think it really rises to a full audit. Where we say, so for example, this period we looked at the foreign wire payments. And so there was some concerns about just the timelines around those, et cetera. So we decided, well, let's go take a look at that and just figure out, do we have any particular process issues, timeline issues, et cetera. And then we can provide that information to the process owners before we come in and do a full audit, where we would, write it up as a larger issue, et cetera. We can just provide some targeted information. There are some situations where an individual process owner may ask a question or want us to dig into something, or potentially senior leaders or maybe even a member of the committee may ask. Though we would entertain all of those reasons for potentially going and doing a SNAP review. But you're right, they don't appear on the audit plan. They're really something that we identify as we're going about our work and decide to spend a little bit of time to provide some focused information on.
And are they more process focused rather than unit focused?
Chair Kenyanya, that is accurate. So I'm trying to think if there's any exceptions to that, but for the most part, they're almost entirely policy or process focused, where we're trying to provide information to a policy owner or a process owner on how compliance is with their particular requirement, or just how things are operating with a particular area that might be under their purview.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yep.
Next, we'll turn to our next agenda item, the FY23 internal audit plan. Chief Auditor Galswick, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, members of the committee. So, thanks, Skeeter. So this item is really looking back at our fiscal year 2022 and helping us to think about what we're going to do in fiscal year 23. So this is our annual report that we provided. Our last item was our 3 times a year. This is the annual one. So in this presentation, I will talk through what our audit results were in FY 2022. I'll then talk about the process that we go through to establish an annual audit plan, the risk assessment and plan development process, before getting into the details of the FY 2023 audit plan specifically. At the end of my presentation, I will talk briefly about our coordination with ERM and PEAK and what I envision that to look like, especially over the next fiscal year, and some other communications, some of which are actually required by Institute of Internal Audit Standards that I communicate to the committee annually. So to begin with, our 2022 audit results. We completed 26 audits in fiscal year 2022, with 92% of those having satisfactory results. Only 8% of those were identified as needing improvement. I think this continues to demonstrate that there's an overall culture of compliance and risk management here at the university. So I think these are very positive results. For the completion of our audit plan, I think we had a very successful year, especially considering the many changes that we went through in the internal audit department, including the change of chief auditor, as well as an overall change in staffing turnover of about 30%, when we're typically closer to a 13% turnover. So, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as I go through this presentation, but staffing has been a major concern for us over the last few months and something that we're continuing to work to address. Despite those challenges, we were able to complete all but 3 of the audits on our annual audit plan. Those 3 items, 2 of those were tier 2 items that I communicated at the February audit committee meeting that we would likely be deferring or canceling if we did not have sufficient resources. There was one swap from what we intended to do at the February audit committee, specifically the tier 1, so our higher priority audit of I-9 temporary process. We had to defer that because the federal government pushed back their timelines on when they're going to change that temporary process to October. So you'll see that now shows up on the FY 2023 audit. So in the February audit committee, we communicated that we would likely defer RecWell. Instead, we started the audit of RecWell, and we are deferring the tier 1 audit. So again, all but 3 being completed or in progress. We do have a number that are in progress, but I think that those are very good results. And just for a frame of reference, in FY 2021, we completed 27 audits. Again, not all audits are identical in size, and they can vary, but I think, again, it's very consistent. We also conducted 4 investigations in alignment with the university policy on reporting and addressing misconduct. And as we were just discussing, we completed 5 SNAP reviews. So how do we develop our annual audit plan? So we go about the development of the annual audit plan in 4 basic phases. The first is gathering information. We run a number of data analytics, pulling information from our central systems to do our quantitative side of our risk assessment. We also do a number of interviews to get an idea of changes at the institution, as well as various perspectives on risk, which moves us into the second category of risk analysis. This audit plan cycle, we met with 108 separate individuals across 59 different units, if I have my numbers right, to get their perspectives on the university. In addition, when we're doing risk analysis, we look at what other major research universities see as major risks. We survey our Big 10 peers and others. We look at federal agencies' audit priorities. We look at recent publications, et cetera. From that information, we then go about developing our audit plan, looking at timelines that we have since the last time we conducted an audit in an area, looking at where there might be new and emerging risks, where there might be areas of request, et cetera. We also make sure that our audit plan ties out to the university's institutional risk profile. The institutional risk profile that we're working from as of now is the one that was established in 2018. I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation about expectations and changes related to that. But then we also ensure that we're doing work that aligns with strategic priorities, including Impact 2025. Once we've developed that audit plan, we communicate it out to senior leaders, met with the president to discuss the audit plan with her, and now I'm here meeting with you. For allocation of resources for FY 2023, what we have here, the blue bars will show you what we budgeted for FY 2022. Our orange is our actuals for FY 2022, and then the red bar is our budget. So for our scheduled audits, you'll see that this number is decreasing this period. That is in large part due to the staffing constraints, where as we have a certain number of kind of administration and work that needs to be done at the management level. If we have fewer staff auditors to go and do the work, that's going to decrease the amount of scheduled audits that we're doing. But we're hoping that we can still keep that at 58% with some successful hiring. If you look at the investigations, I think the important thing to note here is that our budget to actual for FY 2022, we saved 5%. If I'm being honest, I think that was a big reason for why we had a successful year this year, was that despite losing some staff, we got lucky on the number of investigations and we were able to pick up some time to get some more audit work done instead of having to respond to investigations. We plan to keep that number consistent for what we budget next year. The 1% truthfully is more of a rounding issue than anything else. For doing a board and senior leader administration requests for audit work, we plan to keep that at 15%. We've consistently maintained that at 15% for many years for what we budgeted. We actually used 9 this year. Follow-up is an area where we are intending to change the percent that we budget, and we're going to increase that a little bit to tie closer to what our actuals are. We've had a number of years in a row that we've been consistently above that 4 or 5%, so we're going to move that up to a budget of 7% next year. And then administration is an area where we're hoping we're going to get some savings next year. Even though we budgeted 15 and we came in at 18%, we're hoping that we can get some decrease this year, in part because we don't have to spend the administration time related to the chief auditor transition. And again, we're hopeful that as we can bring on some additional staff auditors, that we can get more of the scheduled audit work done. So how do we deploy our audit resources? So again, from the audit plan perspective, we look to try to address high risk activities. However, in addition to the areas that are highest risk, we also think about what are the major organizational components of the university and are we getting good broad coverage? We don't want to just focus on one particular area in a year and then move on to another. We want to make sure we have some broad information coming in. We look at, again, the institutional risk profile, mitigation plans that are in place in the areas of strategic priority. Again, thinking about that institutional risk profile from 2018 and MPACT 2025 especially. We also then pay a special attention to board and management requests. When there's an area where there's considerable concern, we work hard to try to get that addressed in our audit plan one way or another. Okay, so our audit universe. So all of the activities in the university, we ultimately roll up into 177 separate auditable units. We update our risk assessment on these every year. And so again, using both quantitative and qualitative measures. And this year we identified 25 items that are high risk. It's important to note that here we're talking about inherent risk, so that if something is high risk, it doesn't mean it's necessarily poorly managed. It's just something that is very critical to the institution, or just by the nature of its work, it's going to be high risk. So for example, athletics is going to be in the high risk category in perpetuity. That's just how it works, even if things are being very well managed. We identify 110 units as moderate risk and then 42 as low risk. And this is really thinking about it in terms of units. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about how we set up the audit plan between units and process, but this is the way we roll it up from a unit perspective. So from our risk analysis this year, some key themes that were identified from all the individuals we talked to. Staffing was the item that came up maybe the most in our discussions. There's turnover, there's a need for hiring, and there's this continual work being done on the return to work efforts. And what is that going to look like? And what are the hybrid models going to look like? And how do you balance those things? And I think a lot of units are going through these changes, and it's proved challenging, especially in places in hiring where there's competition in the private sector for the same talent. Information security and data management remains high risk. This is pretty consistently up there, both in terms of what people within the institution are thinking, but also outside the institution and federal regulators, et cetera. Campus safety, again, is item that was on our radar last year, and again remains a large concern for the university individuals we talk to, and again our peers as well. We are not unique in this. System campus enrollment and finances is another one carry forward from last year, especially with the declining graduation rates for high school students, and the impacts especially on our system campuses. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. This is something that I think is going to stay on the radar for the years in the years ahead. And we're really just trying to make sure that all feel welcomed here and making sure that we are providing an environment conducive to our mission for everyone. The one that is very new this year is inflation impacts. This is new for I think any risk assessment in the last 40 years, maybe. I looked at Provost Croson, where this is impacting our ability to hire, it's impacting our costs throughout the institution, and it's difficult because we don't have the ability to turn around and raise our revenues 8%. And so I think this is going to be a problem that a number of units are going to be facing. All right, so with all those risks in mind, we then pull together our annual audit plan. So again, we break this into unit and process audits. A quick way of thinking about unit versus process audits is I think of unit audits as verticals and process audits as horizontal. So for a unit audit, we might come in and look at the civil environmental geoengineering department and say, okay, what are all the work that they're doing in this department? What do we believe is the highest risk? Where should we spend our audit resources to provide an opinion on how they're managing their risk? Versus a process audit, I'll come back to this slide in a minute, where again, like I-9 temporary process, we say across the institution, how is this being handled regardless of who's handling this, to provide an opinion on how is the university doing on this particular process. So once we've set that up between the units and process audit priorities, this year again, we're going to be using a two-tier system. So the items that are bolded are what we consider to be our tier 1 or our higher priority audits. The ones that are not bolded are our tier 2. Similar to previous years, we may swap out some of the items on the tier 2 list if new risks emerge, if there's very pressing audits that we need to do. Those would be our lower priority ones that we would potentially swap out. In addition, due to our staffing constraints, the tier 1 versus tier 2 also reflects our priority based upon staffing levels. So the tier 1 audits on our audit plan are the ones that we believe we can complete if we maintain our staffing levels exactly as they are going forward. The tier 2 are the ones that we believe we would complete if we are able to hire 4 additional auditors by January. So to give you an idea of where we're at from a percentage perspective, or as a reminder, we, when fully staffed, have 16 auditors in addition to the chief auditor, and we're currently down 4 of those positions, and we expect a retirement in August. We're continuing to work on hiring, and I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. So that's the idea between the tier 1 and tier 2 this year. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these audits in particular and how they tie out to the institutional risk profile in the slides ahead. Again, this is the university's institutional risk profile that was established in 2018. As we talked about last audit committee meeting in May, I fully expect that this profile will be updated as part of the ERM process this fiscal year. And then similarly, we will work to try to ensure that our work is in alignment with the university's highest risk priorities that are identified from that process. But given that this is still what's in place, we went through and made sure that we were tying out to those. So you can see in the far left column with the maroon X's, the areas in which we believe that our audit coverage, we have audit coverage, particularly in those risks. So to give you an idea of what audits we believe tie out to these various risks, and I'll talk about a couple of these audits in particular more in these slides. First, in the high risk research and clinical misconduct potential areas, we have the Hormel Institute, the Minnesota Supercomputer, and eConsent. I'll pause for a moment on eConsent to explain what that is. It's a new, when the pandemic began, there was suddenly a need for being able to get human participants to be able to consent to participate in research remotely. And so efforts were made, fairly Herculean efforts that were fairly well done from our perspectives when they were happening, were done to get those processes set up. Now that that has been in place for a couple of years and it's being expanded as more of a standard, we want to make sure that we're in alignment with all federal requirements associated with obtaining those e-consents. For athletics, we have 3 audits that we're intending to do with coverage in the athletic space this year. the athletics ticket office. We're going to look at UMD athletics holistically, and then the NCAA sport compliance and operations audit. As a reminder, we do a separate NCAA sport compliance and operations audit in the Twin Cities every year. We rotate through. From an information technology perspective, we have a number of audits here. The ones I haven't mentioned yet, we have Central Server Administration, NextGen Meds, the Central Cloud Platform, Parking and Transportation Services, Boynton Health. So give you a little bit of info on these audits. Central Server Administration, this is really looking at the servers that are provided for users throughout the institution, primarily by OIT, but there are there are other units who have IT professionals who are using those services. NextGen Med, you're going to see that shows up in a number of places here. This is including on this slide where you see the collaboration with externalities and joint ventures. As a reminder, this is a partnership that the University of Minnesota Rochester is working with Google and Mayo to implement, and will likely also be foundational for thinking about NextGen Farm. As this is new, we think it's a good idea to come in and take a look at it this year. I'll probably do it later in the fiscal year to give it some time to settle. But we want to get that information earlier than later, especially if we're using it as a stepping stone. For the Central Cloud Platform, again, thinking about the kind of back-end cloud, not necessarily what the average user is interfacing with, but that's being provided centrally to various IT units throughout the institution, or for various IT services throughout the institution. Again, supercomputing. Parking and Boynton Health Services they have their own electronic medical record system, et cetera. There's just normally quite a bit of IT work in that audit. From a campus safety perspective, we plan to integrate some of those questions and work into our parking and transportation audit, where we will ask some questions about the increase in break-ins to vehicles and some of those safety questions that they're facing, and potentially how they are coordinating with public safety and others to address those. Legal and regulatory compliance, a number of audits here I've already discussed. One I will highlight is GLBA that we haven't discussed yet. This is the federal requirements associated with ensuring personal information is protected for individuals who are working with financial institutions or banking institutions typically. Where this really impacts the university is in our financial aid area. It's a space in which we've heard from some of our peers that there's been some additional compliance focus. So we want to make sure that the university has this all buttoned up. Again, new and disruptive education models, NextGen Med absolutely falls into this category. All right. So when we think about the major components, again, we want to make sure that we're getting good coverage of the institution. I think this chart helps to demonstrate how we're getting that balance. I think it's important to note, however, that though you may see human resources as only 3% or equity and diversity as 1%, that again, when we're doing our unit audits and we're thinking about those verticals, there's very likely going to be HR components to those, to that audit work. There's consistently going to be equity and diversity questions that we're going to be digging into in those unit audits. However, these are just the major components that the audits fall under. So with that, it's my professional opinion that the 2023 audit plan provides a reasonable level of audit coverage across all the major university components. I believe it addresses risks that are currently impacting the university, and I believe it addresses the risk areas identified by the Board of Regents as important. So my last two slides, again, just a couple of discussion points here I want to get out there before I open it up for questions. First, ERM and PEAK. I've already talked about this a little bit, but I want to make sure that the committee understands that we are staying apprised of the work that is being done in these spaces. I serve on the ERM task force and the PEAK steering committee. This helps to keep me informed on the timelines and the expected changes, et cetera. As it relates to ERM, I already mentioned that one of the big items for next fiscal year that I expect is that we're going to have a new risk model, institutional risk model, that we're going to want to ensure that we're tying out our audit plan to. I would say that in the further out, looking further ahead, that I would expect as ERM matures, we're going to have additional information on some key risks and key controls that are maybe a level or two down, that I think will be very informative for where we should be spending our audit resources to make sure that we're finding those good leverage points to ensure risk is being properly managed at the institution. But that's probably a couple of years out. This year, I would expect updated institutional risk model that we are tying out to. For peak, there's a number of potential impacts. I think the most direct that will happen this fiscal year is there could be units as we identify issues, as we talked about earlier this morning, that will say, instead of trying to put together a process and address it in our unit, as part of the larger peak process, we're going to solve it with that. And so this is going to take a year and a half out because we are on the timeline or on the implementation plan for peak. I think that's a reasonable approach, but I think it's going to be something we're going to have to think about. How do we track separately from our follow-up activity to make sure if units are telling us they're going to address this via peak, that it really is getting done, or that they circle back and get it done locally if it turns out that isn't going to happen. So I'm going to look at some different ways of communicating those situations to the committee going forward. Okay, finally, other communications. The first bullet here, no impairments to independence in FY 2022. This is really important and is required by the Institute of Internal Audit that I inform you every year if there were any impediments to our scope or to our audit work, or if anybody provided undue influence on how we go about doing our audit work. I'm happy to say that in fiscal year 2022, that did not occur. We were able to set our own scopes and conduct our work based upon our professional judgment. Secondly, we continue to have highly professional staff that the university is well served by. All but 2 of our staff are credentialed or have advanced degrees, and the 2 that do not have that are currently working on getting their certifications. But again, as I mentioned, we have a 25% vacancy, and that includes 2 of our 3 IT auditor positions, which includes one of the management positions, the IT audit director. Again, when you think back to the audit plan we were talking about before and the tier 1s versus tier 2, the lack of IT auditors is part of the reason why some of those items are falling on the tier 2. That doesn't mean that we think that they're not as important, but we just had to think about the resources we had and what we would be able to do with our current versus if we're able to hire those positions. So with that, I will stand for any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you, Chief Auditor Klatt. Are there any questions? Oh my gosh.
I'll take that as a compliment too, Chair Kenyanya.
Regent Verhalen gave me a look. I'm like, what?
Figured I'd give you a minute.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Questions? Questions from the committee. Regent Strickland. It's your name, right? Okay, all right.
Oh, lots worse. When I've lost my place here now, but I'll try to find it again as I ask my question. I'll go back to the original number of audits and SNAP and then investigations. I think I understand the audit process to SNAP, but the investigations, there were 4 investigations, if I remember. Is that something that, oh, she has it right here. The 4 investigations, that's tell me about the investigations. That's something that the police department or the chief counsel come to you and say, we've got a problem or we've got potential, criminal activity going on, and then you get involved at a lower level than an audit? I'm not sure I understand the investigations.
Sure, Chair Kenyanya, Regent Sviggum. So we can become involved in investigations in a number of different ways. There are times in which individuals who know us, trust us, will come to us with concerns of wrongdoing, misconduct directly. But a number of the investigations we get involved in come in through the U-Report hotline. So that is the anonymous reporting hotline that the institution has that's managed by Boyd Coomer and his team in the compliance office. We're part of the task force that receives all U-Reports that come through. So I get visibility in all of those. That we don't necessarily do work associated with all of those that come through, though. In some cases, a complaint might come in and we say that would make sense for it to be handled by HR, or that's really a OGC type item, et cetera. However, there are areas in which we feel that by the nature of the work that it makes sense for internal audit to be involved. A lot of times those are in financial activities, or frankly, if we don't have, I'd say financial activities, research, or frankly, if we don't have another clear unit that would have the expertise to work in that space. So once we receive those reports, we go about trying to prove or confirm one way or another whether or not the report, whether or not the report has any credibility, or maybe I should say that we can just prove whether or not it is true. We go about doing that in a number of different ways. Oftentimes, it's a lot of work behind the scenes, seeing what information we can pull from systems, et cetera, and ultimately will normally culminate with some interviews with the people who have been potentially accused, or when the reporter has made their identity known. Oftentimes we will meet with the reporter as well to make sure that we're understanding what the allegation is. So does that help explain, Regent Sviggum?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Vice Chair Rocha?
Just didn't really have anything to say. I just wanted to see what you'd call me.
I had other thoughts.
Chief Auditor Galswick, I really appreciate the report. I think this is it's a very good report, good plan, and having a bit of an advantage because we have the pre-committee conversation where you answer a number of questions. I do want to just go on record saying I'd like to keep an eye on how you're doing staffing wise, and I mean it's obviously a very general market for the folks on your team being attracted by other enterprises and so on. And I think the university is a great place to work and so on. But if we could, keep abreast of that as we go forward to make sure that you have the folks that you need. It's a, $4+ billion enterprise and a lot going on. So I really think it's a priority for a board for that kind of oversight. And would just like to emphasize that I'm interested in knowing that you've got the resources you need to be able to put together the teams that you need to stay on top of these important things. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Rocha. And on that point, 2 of the 3 IT auditors were some of the positions, and on one of the slides, CIO activities made up 11% of the audit activities. And I think some of our long outstanding audits are related to IT. So that just really reinforces the importance of that. Yes, Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya, since we have a couple minutes. So if anyone's watching YouTube, they must be interested in audit. I usually look to see how many are watching our different meetings, but I haven't yet. But what kind of requirements are there to be an auditor at the University of Minnesota so that when we're out, recent grads or upcoming grads, what's the requirements? And it would be different, I assume, for IT or whatever the category is they're going to work in.
Yes, Chair Kenyanya, Regent Davenport. So forgive me, this is going to be a little bit of a multi-stage answer here. So we have staff at all different levels, and we really do try to provide a pathway for people to be able to get promoted, right? So traditionally, we would bring a lot of people in straight out of college, and we would train them up, work them up, promote them through our various ranks. You're going to lose a certain percent, but ultimately we would keep enough of those that's really how we did the majority of our staffing. I mean, myself included. I came in after a few years in public accounting and then worked my way up. I will tell you that has become difficult in recent years, in part because there's less and less work that we can really provide to the staff auditors, in part because of increases in automation, data analytics that we're able to do, system controls that exist, the type of work that was really the bread and butter that we would give to someone straight out of school that would, get their feet wet and then they could start to build up from. There's just less and less of that. So currently on our of our 16 auditors, only one of those positions do we really hold open for what we would consider to be entry level. So that would be, somebody who likely has a degree in accounting, finance, that we would bring in. We've had a number of good hires from UMD up there over the years. And so that would be a place where we often will do recruiting. So for what it takes to be an auditor, again, we have our IT audit specialists, and then we have our financial/operational auditors. The financial/operational auditors do some IT audit work. Some of the more straightforward, easier to work through work. But the IT auditors, those are really specialized individuals who have understanding of servers, networks, firewalls, et cetera, so that we can try to provide that kind of specialty view on those particular risks. So for our typical financial auditor, we would probably look for business degrees, accounting degrees, et cetera, a couple years of experience, maybe in accounting or a related field, ideally in audit. But we try to take a pretty broad perspective on that. On the IT side, similarly, we oftentimes will have people who maybe were engineers at some point or worked as server administrators, et cetera, that have made a shift. There's always this trade-off between, do you take somebody who is an IT professional and really understands the IT and teach them audit, or do you take an auditor and try to teach them the IT risks and processes? And there's pros and cons of both approaches, and we've tried both over the years. So does that answer your question, Regent Davenport?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I have two brief comments. Actually, I think I covered one on the peak deferrals, if you will. The conversation about peak and how some units are choosing to defer some changes, probably reasonably so, because of that. I think we had this conversation earlier this is why I was thinking of Chief Auditor Clad, because we had it with her at the time about the same topic. And you brought up a good point about making sure to follow up later on and make sure that those things were implemented. The other comment I would have is on the front end. I would hope, and I'm assuming you are, but you're also validating that claim, that when a unit says, this doesn't really make sense to do right now, that you feel comfortable with that decision in the first place. Because if that's not true, maybe just to their own misunderstanding, not anything nefarious or trying to defer it, that audit would then say, well, no, actually, I think this is something we can address now, or perhaps due to the risk of it, need to address now, and it can't wait a year or two. But that was just a comment, doesn't need a response. Another observation on the institutional risks list you have, again, not a question, just a comment. One thing that I saw was shifting enrollment plans as one of the identified risks, and it, at least in the 3 fiscal years we're looking at, hasn't been covered. I think the provost would agree that that's one of the major risks we're looking at. It's possible it just hasn't fit in anywhere there, but not for FY23, but just going forward. I would hope we pay close attention to that one and look at it where it applies. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Student Representative Tuft.
Thank you, Regent Kenyanya. Very briefly, I'm wondering, so the UMD Health Services, for example, the rating was not good. What does it look like in the future? Does that group get audit? Like, is there an audit for this coming year, or like more? Is it going to happen quicker than it would typically because of that rating? And then do you have just like a quick example of what the kind of process looks like for them to increase their rating?
Chief Auditor Galswick, I believe the follow-up process to that negative or audit result for UMD Health Services.
Yes, Chair Kenyanya, Student Representative Tuff. So just to briefly kind of explain how we handle our follow-up process. So As we're going through in conducting our audits, any item that we rate as essential, which is our highest risk item, we will come back to the unit or the process owner every or 3 times a year, every 4 months, until that item has been remediated. And so if we go back to the first presentation that I had when I was talking about the follow-up results, that's really the implementation rates associated with those essential items on previous audit reports. So for UMD Health Services, we will continue to go back every 4 months to say, what progress has been made to address these issues. We'll gather evidence to make sure that those risks are addressed. If you want to know what it looks like, if you go way back to page 19 in your materials, you'll see that's where we'll use our bar charts that we include on all of our reports, and we'll slowly take that red out to try to give a depiction of where we believe the current risk levels are at. And again, earlier I was talking about inherent risk. This is when we're looking at these charts, these are really residual risks. So this is whatever the inherent risk is, less the controls that are in place. And so as they implement additional controls to address their inherent risk, that red will come out of those charts. So does that answer your question, Student Representative Tuff?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, Regent Tarabe.
I know that this is about internal audits. I'm curious, are there circumstances in which you would engage an external auditor, and how does that, I guess, how does that come to be?
Chief Auditor.
Yep, Chair Kenyanya, Regent Tawarabe. So there are a number of places where the university has external auditors that are coming in and working with us. So the most prominent of those is Deloitte, who you've seen come and present to the Audit and Compliance Committee a number of times. We will put reliance on their work. So we try not to cover the same work that Deloitte has covered. There are some exceptions to that. For example, we would look at the PeopleSoft information security controls, which they do at least a high-level review of when they're doing their audit work. But we try to leverage their work on areas of research uniform guidance, financial aid, and then the overall financials, for example. There's some other places where we leverage other external auditors, specifically CAPM, where they're looking at the building to look when we are building buildings in structures. We will bring in outside auditing firms to make sure that those contracts that we have with the people who are doing that building is being adhered to, that work orders are being properly managed, et cetera. Again, we will put reliance on that work. If your question is, does the internal audit department bring in outside auditors to help supplement our work? We can. We do have some amount of money budgeted for doing that. An example where we have done this recently was when we did an audit of the anatomy bequest program. We brought in an expert from the Mayo Clinic who really understood how inventories of cadavers that have been donated to us should be managed, to get some of that expertise and some of that perspective. Some places where we might do that in the future, I think, is especially in the IT realm. I'm thinking about like the Minnesota supercomputer audit. Is there room to bring in some outside expertise to say, do we have the right audit plan in place, et cetera? So we have that ability to bring in an outside firm to help supplement our audit work. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Seeing no other questions or comments, I would turn it back to you for any closing remarks on the agenda item.
Thank you, Chair Kenyanya. I would just end by, again, I appreciate the ongoing support to Regent Rocha's comment earlier on the staffing. The support both we received from the committee and from the administration is appreciated. Especially want to call out that HR has been especially helpful in providing us some support with talent acquisition, and people who have been doing a lot of work making phone calls for us and trying to bring in people. So I want to state that we really do appreciate that support, and we're working hard to refill those positions. I think we're a great place to work, just at the very base level, and we're all part of a larger mission. And so I think once we get people in, they tend to like it here. It's just hard to get the people in. So
you just have to bring them to audit committee meetings.
there you go.
All right, with that, thank you everyone for a great meeting and for indulging my mental lapses. Before we adjourn, I'll remind everyone that the Finance and Operations Committee will be beginning shortly at 9:15 back here. There being no additional business before the committee, we stand adjourned.
Thank you.